Obesity and nutrition. For people in many countries, one of the great triumphs of modern life is that there is a great abundance of food. In those places, problems such as starvation and malnutrition are no longer prevalent, and people do not worry about going hungry. Despite the fact that there is plenty of food in modern countries, people still face many health problems that are related to their diet. One problem is that modern technology has made it possible to produce cheap and tasty food that is not very healthy. This leads to the problem that many people are obese or very overweight. One example of this is the fast food that is served by many restaurants. This food is often cooked by frying. Fried foods contain a high proportion of fat. Also, fast food meals are often very large. When people frequently eat large amounts of fried fast food, they will likely eat too much fat. This excess can lead to weight gain. Of course, many people enjoy the taste of fried fast food and like to eat it occasionally. However, eating this kind of food too often is bad for one's health. Another example of health problems caused by modern food products involve soft drinks and other sweetened beverages. These drinks, sometimes called pop, have a sweet taste that many people enjoy on occasion. However, these drinks contain large amounts of sugar. When people drink soft drinks very frequently, they consume a great deal of sugar. This excess sugar can lead to weight gain. The weight gain that can result from consuming too much fast food and too many soft drinks can have several harmful effects. For example, people who are very obese have an increased risk of heart disease and of diabetes. Of course, fast food and soft drinks are not the only causes of obesity. Other eating habits may be involved, and so are lack of exercise and genetic factors. To avoid the health problems that are associated with obesity, it is important that one does not eat too much food. However, this does not mean that one should try to eat as little as possible. People need an adequate amount of food in order to stay healthy. Also, it is important to avoid new fad diets that become popular from time to time because these are often unsafe. Some of the diets that are recommended in popular books do not contain adequate amounts of nutrients, such as vitamins and minerals. Instead, one should try to eat foods that are nutritious. For example, foods such as fruits, vegetables, grains, and lean meats have many vitamins and minerals that are needed for good health. People whose diets consists mainly of these foods will probably be much healthier on average than people whose diets contain too many foods that have high levels of fat or sugar. In addition, many of these nutritious foods are also very tasty and enjoyable to eat. Sexual harassment. When an employee is subjected to unwanted sexual advances or comments by a coworker or an employer, we say that the employee is experiencing sexual harassment. In some workplaces, sexual harassment is a serious problem. In its most blatant form, a boss may demand sexual favors from an employee and threaten to fire the employee if she fails to comply. Similarly, the employer might promise a promotion or raise in exchange for some sexual favor. Whenever an employer uses the prospect of reward or punishment as a way of obtaining sexual access to an employee, sexual harassment has occurred. This is not the only form of sexual harassment. Sometimes an employee may be subjected to demeaning comments by her employer or coworker. For example, a boss might make vulgar comments about the physical appearance of the employee. Another example is that a coworker might make remarks that speculate about the sexual behavior of the employee. In both of these cases, the employee is treated disrespectfully on the basis of her sex, so both cases would represent sexual harassment. Some forms of sexual harassment are more subtle. If a group of workers exchanges offensive jokes of a sexual nature in such a way that they can be easily overheard by other workers, then this is also a form of sexual harassment. Similarly, if workers post pornographic pictures in their workplace in such a way that they can be seen by other workers, then this also represents sexual harassment. In both cases, the workplace becomes an environment in which the employee is made to feel uncomfortable because of her sex. Sexual harassment usually involves a female employee who is being bothered by a male employer or coworker. In some cases, a woman might sexually harass a man, or one person might sexually harass another person of the same sex. However, these cases are not as common. Also, in some cases, the person who commits sexual harassment is not a boss or coworker, but a customer or a visitor to the workplace. Sexual harassment is a form of intimidation and abuse of power that causes much stress for many employees. In recent years, many steps have been taken to reduce the occurrence of sexual harassment. Educational campaigns have been designed to teach people that sexual harassment is wrong. Stronger penalties for sexual harassment have been introduced. Another way to reduce the prevalence of sexual harassment is to develop a culture of respect in the workplace. People need to be aware of how their jokes or comments might be perceived by others, and to imagine how they would feel if one of their relatives were subjected to sexual harassment. Employers and employees must recognize that sexual harassment is a serious concern and treat potential cases of sexual harassment very seriously. Each company should have clear policies about sexual harassment, and each should establish a fair and efficient process for dealing with complaints of this kind. In this way, the workplace can be a comfortable environment for all persons. Cultural differences, individualism, and collectivism. The many cultures of the world differ in a great variety of ways. One of the most interesting ways in which cultures vary is in the extent to which they are individualistic or collectivistic. An individualist society and a collectivist society are different in many ways. In an individualistic culture, each person tends to think of himself or herself in terms of his or her own characteristics and preferences, the things that make the person unique or different from others. In a collectivistic culture, each person tends to think of himself or herself in terms of his or her social relationships and roles, the things that make the person a part of a larger group, such as an extended family or an ethnic group. Another difference between individualist and collectivist cultures involves the tendency to help others. In an individualist society, people feel some obligation to help persons who share some group identity, such as their distant relatives or persons from the same town, but this obligation is not nearly as strong as in collectivist cultures. On the other hand, people in collectivist cultures tend to feel very little inclination to help other people who do not belong to their groups, whereas people in individualist cultures are more often willing to help others even if they do not belong to the same group. Another difference between individualist and collectivist cultures involves the relationship between people and the groups to which they belong. In an individualist culture, people usually join or leave groups when it is in their personal interest to do so. In a collectivist culture, people usually stay with one group for a long time. For example, people in individualist societies are more willing to quit their job and take a new job at another company. People in collectivist societies usually prefer to stay with one company throughout their career. Similarly, people in individualist countries usually get married for reasons of personal choice and are more likely to get divorced. However, people in collectivist societies usually get married according to the wishes of their relatives and are less likely to get divorced. Western countries, such as those of Western Europe and North America, are usually considered to be very individualist. However, not all individualist countries are similar in every way. For example, the individualism of the United States is viewed as more competitive than that of socialist countries such as Sweden. In contrast to Western countries, the countries of most parts of Asia and Africa are usually considered to be very collectivist. Collectivist countries also differ from each other in many ways. The idea of individualism versus collectivism is an interesting way to understand some of the differences between cultures. By learning about ideas like this, one can better appreciate the customs of other peoples. The Protestant Reformation. Until about 500 years ago, there was only one Christian church in Western and Central Europe. People from Portugal to Poland all belonged to the Roman Catholic Church. However, soon after the year 1500, people in many parts of Europe broke away from the Roman Catholic Church and began their own churches instead. This was known as the Protestant Reformation. The leader of the early Protestant movement was a German theologian named Martin Luther. Luther believed that many of the priests of the Roman Catholic Church had become too concerned about wealth and luxury. Also, he disapproved of some practices in the church. One such practice was that priests allowed people to pay money to the church in exchange for committing various sins. Luther believed that it was wrong to allow people to buy the freedom to commit acts that were against the teachings of the church. Luther began to criticize the Roman Catholic Church in public, and he refused to acknowledge the authority of the church. He said that instead he would follow the teachings of the Bible as he understood them. The officials of the church declared that Luther was a heretic. However, the local German rulers did not punish Luther. Many of them resented the power of the church and welcomed his ideas. Luther and other Protestant leaders disagreed with the church on several important issues. The Protestants believed that priests should be allowed to marry, whereas the Roman Catholic Church believed that priests should remain celibate. The Protestants believed that people should read the Bible for themselves, whereas the Roman Catholic Church believed that priests should interpret the Bible for the people. During the decades that followed Luther, the Protestant movement spread throughout much of Europe. Over time, many different Protestant churches were formed. During this period, many wars were fought between local rulers who favored Protestantism and other local rulers who supported the Roman Catholic Church. In the end, many parts of Europe became Protestant, such as Scandinavia, England, and parts of Germany, Holland, and Switzerland. However, the people and rulers of many other areas of Europe preferred to remain in the Roman Catholic Church. These areas included most of southern Europe as well as Poland and Ireland. The Roman Catholic Church changed a few of its practices in response to Protestant criticism, but kept its most important beliefs. In recent times, relations between the Roman Catholic Church and the various Protestant churches have become much more friendly. Some discussions have been held between Catholic and Protestant officials in order to resolve some of their disagreements. Modern engineering wonders. During the 20th century, there were great improvements in engineering technology. These new developments allowed the construction of many amazing tunnels, bridges, towers, and office buildings. For centuries, people had dreamed about the possibility of connecting the island of Great Britain to the mainland of Europe. However, it was only in 1994 that such a link was completed when a tunnel was dug under the English Channel between England and France. The Channel Tunnel, also known as the Channel, actually consists of 3 separate railway tunnels. These tunnels are about 50 kilometers long. They are located about 150 meters below the bottom of the sea. Obviously, this was an extremely challenging project to undertake. As a result of the tunnel, it is now possible to travel between London and Paris by train. And the trip takes only 3 hours, of which only 20 minutes are spent inside the tunnel. A suspension bridge is a bridge that is supported by strong wires that hang from tall towers. The world's longest suspension bridge is the Akashi Kaiko Bridge near the city of Kobe, Japan. This bridge is nearly 4 kilometers long, and the 2 towers near the middle of the bridge are about 2 kilometers apart. It took almost 20 years to design this bridge and 10 years to build it. This bridge was designed to withstand extremely strong winds because Japan often experiences windstorms called typhoons. The bridge was also designed to withstand powerful earthquakes, which sometimes hit Japan. At the beginning of the 21st century, the world's tallest freestanding tower was the Canadian National Tower, or the CN Tower. The CN Tower is 553 meters tall. It is located in the city of Toronto, within the Canadian province of Ontario. This structure was built in 1975 as a television and radio tower. Before the CN Tower was built, TV and radio reception in the Toronto area was poor. This was because the TV and radio signals were blocked by the buildings of downtown Toronto. When the CN Tower was built, this problem was solved. Of course, the CN Tower is also a famous tourist attraction. People can ride in the very fast elevators that take them to observation areas, which are at about 350 and 450 meters above the ground. Although the CN Tower is the world's tallest tower, it is not an office building. The tallest buildings in the world are the Petronas Towers in the city of Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, and the Sears Tower in the American city of Chicago. The Sears Tower, which is 442 meters tall, was completed in 1974. It has 110 floors, and its top floor is the highest office floor in the world. However, the Petronas Towers reach slightly higher, to a height of 452 meters. The Petronas Towers were completed in 1998. Obviously, the late 20th century witnessed some amazing achievements of engineering. It will be very interesting to see what new wonders will be constructed in the 21st century. Anne Sullivan and Helen Keller. The story of Anne Sullivan and Helen Keller is the story of a dedicated teacher and an eager student. The story is very remarkable and inspiring because the teaching was done without sight and without sound. Helen Keller was born in the American state of Alabama in 1880. She was a happy and healthy baby, but before she reached the age of 2, she was struck by a severe fever. As a result of this fever, she became both deaf and blind. After her illness, the young Helen Keller learned to use her other senses. For example, she touched other people's hands to figure out what they were doing. In this way, she also learned that people could communicate by moving their lips. Helen could not talk. Instead, she communicated with her family by making sign movements with her hands and body. However, Helen became very frustrated by her inability to see, hear, and talk. She often became very angry and had many temper tantrums. When Helen Keller was 6 years old, her family took her to see Dr. Alexander Graham Bell, who was an expert on educating deaf children. This man was also famous for inventing the telephone. As a result of this visit, Helen's parents hired a tutor for their daughter. The tutor was a very intelligent deaf woman named Sullivan. At first, it was difficult to teach Helen because she still made many angry outbursts. Gradually, Sullivan gained Helen's trust. One day, Anne began to teach Helen to communicate. Anne took Helen to a well and pumped some water onto Helen's hand. Then Anne used her finger to write the letters W-A-T-E-R onto Helen's hand. By repeating this, Anne was able to teach Helen how to write the word water. As soon as Helen learned that things could be named in this way, she wanted to learn the names of many other objects and actions. She was curious about many things and learned a great number of words. She also learned to read by using the Braille alphabet. This alphabet allows the reader to feel letters and words which are represented by bumps on a page. Also, Helen learned to talk by feeling and then copying the movements of people's mouths. When Helen Keller was 16 years old, Anne Sullivan went with her to college. Anne acted as Helen's interpreter, and Helen was very successful in her studies. After her graduation, Helen dedicated her life to improving conditions for the blind, the deaf, and the poor. Anne Sullivan died in 1936 and was remembered as the miracle worker for a triumph in educating Helen Keller. After Anne's death, Helen continued to give lectures in countries around the world and was active in many political causes. She met with presidents and prime ministers and helped to improve conditions for people who were deaf or blind. At the time of her death in 1968, Helen Keller was one of the most admired people in the world.
The automobile, or car. In many ways, the automobile has been one of the most important inventions of the modern age. People have been able to travel much more freely and across much greater distances than was possible in the past. The automobile, which most people refer to as the car, has also had some harmful consequences, such as pollution and accidents. However, it is clear that life has changed profoundly as a result of the car. Modern cars are very complicated, but the basic idea of how a car works can be described briefly. When the keys are turned in the ignition of the car, this creates a spark that ignites some gasoline vapor inside a cylinder. Then, the rapid expansion of this vapor pushes against a part called a piston. The movement of the piston then causes a turning motion in a shaft that is connected to the wheels. The wheels turn, and the car moves. The invention of the car and the engines used by cars happened gradually in the late 19th century, mainly in France and Germany. In the early 20th century, an American engineer named Henry Ford developed a new way of making cars. Instead of having one worker produce an entire car, he had each worker perform one part of the production of many different cars. This system was very efficient and allowed the mass production of cars. The first car to be produced in large numbers was called the Model T. The Model T Ford and other cars that were soon produced in large numbers were cheap enough that many people could afford to buy them. Many new roads were built and paved throughout North America to allow cars to be driven from town to town. People were able to travel much more easily and to visit places that had previously been difficult to reach. Some problems also came with the widespread use of cars. One of these problems was air pollution, because car engines burn gasoline, which produces poisonous exhaust fumes. Gradually, new laws and new technology have led to reductions in the air pollution that is caused by cars. Moreover, cars today are much more fuel efficient than they were in the past, requiring less gasoline to travel a given distance. However, this pollution is still a problem because of the many millions of cars that are used each day. Another problem has been car accidents, which have caused many thousands of deaths each year. During the 1960s, some journalists brought attention to the unsafe features of many cars. As a result, the safety of cars has been greatly improved. In addition, the use of seatbelts is now required by law. However, car accidents continue to be a serious problem. The future is likely to bring many interesting new changes to the car. Improvements in the safety of cars, in fuel efficiency, and in the cleanliness of car emissions are continuing to be made. Also, the increasing use of the car in economically developing countries will probably have important effects upon people's lives around the world. Sexual attitudes and behavior. During the past several decades, there have been major changes within most Western countries in people's attitudes towards sex and in sexual behavior. For people who have lived throughout this period, the changes have seemed quite remarkable. Until the early 20th century, people in most Western countries did not have permissive attitudes regarding sexuality. For the most part, young people were expected to wait until marriage before having sexual intercourse. Of course, some premarital sex did occur, and prostitution was not rare. However, sexual behavior was relatively restricted. As the 20th century progressed, there was a gradual trend toward liberalization of attitudes towards sex. However, this trend was greatly speeded after 1960, when the first birth control pills became available. These contraceptive pills made it possible for women to engage in sexual intercourse without much risk of an unwanted pregnancy. As a result, many women were more willing to have premarital sex than was previously the case. Also during the 60s, Western countries were reaching high levels of wealth and education. A new and very large generation of young people was approaching adulthood, and there was a mood of rebellion against traditional norms. There was an increase in the number of people who engaged in sex before marriage, and also a greater openness about such behavior. By the 1970s, sexual attitudes had become quite liberal, and many young people were quite promiscuous in their sexual behavior. However, this pattern reversed somewhat during the 1980s. There was increased concern about sexually transmitted diseases, including AIDS. Moreover, many young women had been uncomfortable with the idea of unrestricted sexual behavior. As a result, sexual attitudes became slightly more conservative during the 1980s and 1990s, although they remained much more liberal than in previous decades. In the early 21st century, most young people in Western countries begin having sex during their high school years, although some people wait until they are considerably older. Some young people are promiscuous, but most engage in monogamous relationships that typically last for a period of several months or a few years. When one relationship ends, another usually begins soon after. This pattern usually continues until marriage. After marriage, most people have sex exclusively with their spouse. However, some people do commit adultery. Sexuality has changed a great deal in recent decades. It will be very interesting to see how people's sexual attitudes and behavior will change in the future.
The rights of the accused. In English-speaking countries, the rights of an accused person are taken very seriously. Over many centuries, laws evolved in such a way that people could not be arrested or charged without a very good reason. Of course, every country needs to enforce its laws, This means that police officers are needed, and so are prosecutors, the lawyers whose job is to make criminal charges against people who break the laws and to prove that those charges are true. However, it is very important that people's freedoms are not taken away wrongly. People should not be punished unfairly, and people who are accused of crimes must have the opportunity to defend themselves. In some parts of the world, people can be arrested and imprisoned for long periods of time without any criminal charges being made against them. One of the most important principles of justice in English-speaking countries is that a person cannot be held by the police unless that person is charged with a crime. This principle is known by the Latin term habeas corpus. According to the idea of habeas corpus, the police are not allowed to detain a person for more than a certain period of time, usually 24 hours, unless some charge is made against the person. A judge will order the release of a person who is not charged with a crime. Another important feature of justice systems in most English-speaking countries is that accused individuals have the right to be represented by a lawyer. Most accused people want to hire an expert lawyer. However, even if a person cannot afford to hire a lawyer, the criminal court must provide a lawyer who will represent that person. The lawyer for an accused person is required to defend that person as thoroughly as possible. One of the most important aspects of justice systems in the United States and the British Commonwealth is that an accused person must be fully informed of any charges made against them. Also, any evidence that will be used to show the accused person's guilt must be shared with the accused person and with that person's lawyer. In this way, accused persons can challenge the truth of any evidence that will be used against them. Similarly, any person who acts as a witness against an accused person can be cross-examined by the accused person's lawyer. This means that the statements of a witness can be challenged by the accused person. Another important element of most English-speaking justice systems is that evidence must be obtained fairly. Police officers cannot simply enter a person's home to look for evidence of a crime. They must first have a good reason to believe that a crime has been committed, and they must obtain permission from a judge to enter the person's property. This permission is called a search warrant. Because search warrants are required, people are free from arbitrary invasions of their property by police. Finally, another important aspect of most English-speaking justice systems is that trials must be held in public, where other citizens can watch the trial. An accused person is not tried secretly. Moreover, as discussed in another passage, the accused person has the right to be tried by a jury of other free citizens. All of these rules ensure that order can be maintained without taking away the freedom of innocent people. New York City. New York City is the largest city in the United States and one of the largest cities in the world. The city of New York has a population of over 7 million people, and the surrounding urban areas bring the total to about 20 million people. However, New York City is not merely a very large city. It is also known as one of the world's leading centers of financial, artistic, and media activities. Compared with most of the great cities of the world, New York is very young. The first permanent settlements were established during the 17th century by settlers from the Netherlands. Those people named their town New Amsterdam. Soon, the colony was taken over by English settlers who renamed the city New York. New York grew quickly, and by the 19th century, it was the largest city of the United States. New York was usually the place where new immigrants to the United States would arrive. In the 19th century, immigrants from Germany and Ireland were numerous in New York. In the early 20th century, New York City was the home of many Jewish immigrants and also immigrants from Italy. In addition, many African American people arrived in New York from other parts of the United States, and many persons came to New York from the American territory of Puerto Rico, a Spanish-speaking island in the Caribbean. In more recent decades, immigrants have arrived in New York from places all over the world. One of the most famous features of New York City is its dramatic skyline. New York has more tall buildings, called skyscrapers, than any other city in the world. Many of the tallest and most interesting buildings in New York, including the Woolworth Building, the Chrysler Building, and the Empire State Building, were constructed during the early decades of the 20th century. In addition to these impressive buildings, New York is also known for the huge bridges that join the island of Manhattan to the surrounding areas. The Brooklyn Bridge is the most famous of these remarkable and old bridges. Of course, New York is famous for much more than just its architecture. New York City's financial district, Wall Street, and its theater district, centered on Broadway, are the most important in the United States. Central Park is one of the world's great urban parks, and the art galleries, museums, and concert halls are among the greatest to be found anywhere. The United Nations has its headquarters in New York City. People around the world recognize the famous Statue of Liberty, which stands on an island in the harbor of New York, and the bustling Times Square, located in the Midtown Manhattan area. Visitors to New York find it to be an extremely busy, fast-paced city and are struck by the extremes of wealth and poverty that surround it. Many people love New York City, but even those who would not want to live in New York do agree that it is a very interesting place. California. By far the most populous state of the United States is California. Located in the southwestern corner of the United States, California is home to a great diversity of natural environments and cultural influences. In the year 2000, over 33 million people lived in California. California's many mountains and valleys produce a wide variety of climates and natural regions. In the interior, southeastern parts of the state are many areas of desert. For example, Death Valley, which is so deep that it is below sea level, is extremely dry. Temperatures in Death Valley sometimes exceed 50 degrees Celsius. Other valleys are more pleasant and hospitable places. In the Central Valley, many farms grow vast amounts of fruits and vegetables. California also contains many tall, snow-covered mountains. On the slopes of some mountains are forests that have very large trees. Some of the giant redwood trees of California reach heights of 100 meters or more. Many of the cities in California have Spanish names. This is because many of those cities began as religious missions that were started by Spanish priests. Mexico owned California during the early 19th century, but few Mexican people lived there. The United States gained control of California during the 1840s, and the discovery of gold brought many Americans and others to California. Today, California contains some of the largest cities in the United States. Within the greater Los Angeles area, one can find Hollywood, known as the movie capital of the world. Many rich people live in suburbs such as Beverly Hills, and many poor people live in other neighborhoods throughout the city. The Los Angeles area is home to over 15 million people, many of whom have immigrated to the United States from Mexico and from many Asian countries. Los Angeles is a very large city that has spread across a great area. As a consequence, the city has many traffic jams, and air pollution, or smog, is sometimes a problem. Further north is the city of San Francisco, one of the most beautiful cities of the United States. The image of the Golden Gate Bridge, which crosses the harbor of San Francisco, is famous around the world. Also famous are the hilly streets of San Francisco and the trolley cars that provide transportation along them. San Francisco's Chinese community is one of the largest in North America, and the city also contains a vibrant artistic and cultural life. San Francisco was destroyed by an earthquake in 1906 and was damaged again in 1989. California has always had a special place in the imagination of Americans. This is hardly surprising, given the variety and diversity of this vast state. Drug use among athletes. Drug use is a common problem in many sports competitions today. In both professional and amateur sports, many athletes use drugs that are designed to improve athletic performance. The use of these drugs may have harmful effects on the future health of athletes, but they also give an unfair advantage in athletic competitions. Some of the most widely used performance-enhancing drugs are called anabolic steroids. Anabolic steroids are drugs that are very similar to the male hormone testosterone. These drugs allow athletes to develop larger and stronger muscles and to increase the intensity of training. For sports that require strength, power, or speed, the use of steroids can provide advantages. In past years, many famous sprinters and weightlifters have been found to have used steroids. However, anabolic steroids have many negative side effects. To give just a few examples, steroids can cause changes in mood, including irritability and anger, and can also cause skin problems such as acne. In men, steroid use can lead to reduction in the functioning of the testicles. In women, steroid use can interfere with menstruation. In both men and women, long-term side effects include an increased risk of some forms of cancer. Another widely used drug is known as EPO. EPO is a hormone that helps to produce red blood cells, which carry oxygen to the muscles. When taken by athletes who compete in sports that require great endurance, EPO may provide an advantage by allowing the athletes to maintain their speed for a longer time and distance. During 1998, there was a scandal at a famous bicycle race, the Tour de France, when it was found that many of these long-distance cyclists were using EPO to gain an advantage over their competitors. EPO has side effects. For example, it increases the likelihood of developing blood clots, which increase the risk of a stroke or heart attack. One difficulty in preventing the use of performance-enhancing drugs is that it is not always possible to detect the use of the drugs. Tests have been developed to detect the drugs, but new varieties of the drugs are often not detected. Also, athletes who stop using the drugs well before a drug test may avoid being detected. Preventing the use of performance-enhancing drugs in athletes is difficult, but it is important. Most athletes want to compete without using artificial substances that provide easy advantages, and they do not want to risk their health by using these substances. If those athletes are to have a fair chance, it is necessary to prevent other athletes from gaining advantages due to the use of these drugs.
Scotland. Scotland is the country that is located on the northern part of the island of Great Britain. The Scottish people are one of the four main nationalities of the British Isles, together with the English, the Welsh, and the Irish. Scotland and its people have played an important part in the history of the English-speaking world. Scotland can be roughly divided into two main regions. The lowland areas in the southern part of Scotland contain most of the population and the two main cities, Edinburgh and Glasgow. Most of Scotland's agriculture and industry are located in the lowland areas. The highland areas, together with the islands that lie off the coast of Scotland, are not so heavily populated. The lakes and mountains of the highlands are known for their beautiful scenery. One of the main themes of Scottish history is conflict with England. During the Middle Ages, the English and Scottish kings were often at war. Around the year 1300, the Scots repelled some invasions from England. During the 1600s, though, Scotland and England had the same king, and the countries were officially joined as the United Kingdom in 1701. For people in the Highlands of Scotland, the 18th century was very difficult. Most people worked as farmers on land that was owned by a few wealthy landlords. The landlords decided that they could make more money on the land if they evicted the farmers, so many of the farmers were forced to leave. The Highlanders rebelled against the king in 1745, but they were defeated. During the 18th and 19th centuries, many people left the Highlands of Scotland. They moved to the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. During the 19th century, Scotland was the first country to have universal public education for children. The country produced a great number of famous scientists and inventors during that time. Scotland is famous for its national costume. This costume includes the kilt, which is a knee-length skirt worn by both men and women. The kilt is made from a fabric that contains stripes of different colors and widths, which cross over each other to produce a pattern that is called a tartan. In the Scottish Highlands, groups of related families called clans have their own unique tartan. Another famous part of Scottish heritage is the musical instrument known as the bagpipes. The bagpipes have a distinctive sound that is easily recognized. Bagpipes were originally played to intimidate enemies in battle, but today Scottish people play the bagpipes at parades and other celebrations. People of Scottish heritage around the world celebrate their heritage on January 25th of each year. This day celebrates the birthday of Robbie Burns, the famous Scottish poet. People celebrate this day at parties where people eat a famous Scottish food called haggis. Today, Scotland remains part of the United Kingdom, but some Scottish people would like Scotland to become independent. Whatever the Scottish people decide, their country will remain a unique and interesting place. London. The city of London is one of the most famous cities in the world. In previous centuries, London was the center of the British Empire. Today, it is one of the most important cities of the emerging European Union. London is located in southeastern England on the Thames River. The Greater London area contains about 12 million people, and the surrounding areas contain several million more. London was the first city in the modern world to have reached a population of 1 million people. London is a very old city, and many of its neighborhoods maintain their distinct character. One of the most famous parts of London is the East End, where people speak with an accent known as Cockney. One of the features of the Cockney accent is that the letter H is often not pronounced. London's population is very cosmopolitan. The city contains, in addition to people of English background, large communities of South Asian, Chinese, African, and Caribbean people. Most of these people have their origins in countries that belong to the British Commonwealth of Nations. Many of the most famous buildings in London are located in a small central area. This area contains several huge churches, including Westminster Abbey, where many famous people are buried. Another famous church is St. Paul's Cathedral, which was rebuilt after the original was destroyed by fire in the year 1665. The Houses of Parliament are also found in central London. These buildings are famous for their Gothic architecture and for the sound of the large clock known as Big Ben. The Tower of London, which was formerly used as a prison, is now a popular tourist attraction. Buckingham Palace, the residence of the royal family, was first opened for public viewing during the 1990s. London is also famous for its many impressive museums, art galleries, and theaters. For example, the British Museum contains priceless objects from all parts of the world. The National Gallery holds a great collection of artistic masterpieces. The Globe Theatre has been rebuilt to appear as it did during the time of Shakespeare. Despite its age, London remains a vibrant and busy city. Most of the cultural and financial institutions in England are located in London, and the city attracts many young people from other parts of England and around the world. Of course, London is popular with tourists who come to see the many attractions of the city. Soccer. Soccer is the most popular sport in the world. The basic rules of the sport are simple. 2 teams of 11 players try to kick the soccer ball into the opposing team's goal. Only 1 player on each team, the goalkeeper, is allowed to touch the ball with hands or arms. Perhaps part of the reason for the popularity of soccer is its simplicity. The game requires no expensive equipment, merely a ball and a playing surface, preferably a large grassy area. For children in most parts of the world, soccer is the sport that is played most widely. Soccer is also known as football, especially in England. However, soccer should not be confused with American football, Australian rules football, and rugby football, which are very different sports. Although the basic rules of soccer are easy to learn, it is very difficult to master the skills of the game. The best soccer players have developed through natural talent and hard work a remarkable ability to control the soccer ball with their feet, knees, torso, and head. They can pass the ball very accurately or shoot the ball very hard. The most famous soccer tournament is the World Cup. Every 4 years, teams representing countries from around the world play in a tournament to decide which country has the best soccer team in the world. Because soccer is such a popular sport, it is not possible for every country in the world to be represented at the World Cup tournament. To decide which countries may participate in the World Cup, it is necessary to have tournaments within various regions of the world. The countries that perform well within their parts of the world can then proceed to the World Cup. In the past, most of the available places at the World Cup have been reserved for teams from Europe and from South America. The reason for this is that soccer has been extremely popular in these continents, which have produced the winning teams in previous World Cup tournaments. Recently, however, several African and Asian countries have played quite well at the World Cup, so there are now additional places provided for teams from Africa and Asia. Someday, teams from these areas will win the World Cup. However, there will no doubt be strong competition from countries that have traditionally had very strong teams, such as Argentina, England, Brazil, France, Germany, Italy, and the Netherlands. In many parts of the world, soccer has been an increasingly popular sport for women. There are now many soccer leagues and tournaments available for women athletes, and it seems likely that the number of women who play soccer will someday equal the number of men who play soccer. Among children in many parts of the world, soccer is equally popular for boys and girls. Extinctions. Ever since human beings appeared on the earth, we have had a serious impact on other living things. One of the most serious results of the human presence has been the extinction of other species. Since the arrival of humans, many species of animals and plants have died out as a result of human activity. The extinction of species is a serious problem. When certain species are eliminated, this may disrupt the balance of nature, leading to overpopulation of some species and extinction of others. These changes may have an impact on humans. Also, some of the species that become extinct might have had benefits for human beings. For example, scientists believe that some of the plants growing in rainforest areas might be valuable for treating human diseases. If these plants become extinct as a result of human activity, then these treatments will never be found. The earliest extinctions caused by humans occurred very long ago. Modern humans emerged in Africa over 100,000 years ago, and some of those people migrated to other parts of the world. When they reached new areas, they found that it was very easy to hunt the large animals, which had not previously been hunted by humans. As these prehistoric people moved into Europe, Australia, and the Americas, they killed large numbers of large animals. Within a few hundred years, many species of animals had become extinct. For example, prehistoric people reached New Zealand less than 1,000 years ago, but they soon hunted a huge bird called the giant moa to extinction. With the beginnings of modern technology several hundred years ago, many other species were driven to extinction. Hunters armed with guns were able to kill vast numbers of animals. In North America, this led to the extinction of bird species such as the passenger pigeon, which had previously been very numerous. Other species were nearly wiped out, such as the large prairie mammals called bison. There were once millions of these animals, but now only a few thousand remain. Today, many more species of animals and plants are going extinct. Sometimes this happens because of human expansion into areas that are the habitat of certain species. When people clear a forest, some species may be lost. In the near future, many other extinctions are possible or likely. In some cases, the problem is due to human greed. For example, some people buy ivory that is taken from the bodies of animals such as elephants or rhinoceros. Hunters sometimes kill these animals simply to take their ivory, and the result is a tragic decline in populations. Another example involves bears in North America. Some people buy the sexual organs of these animals for use as aphrodisiacs or sexual stimulants. The result is that hunters kill bears simply to obtain these organs, and this leads to a reduction in the number of bears. Fortunately, many countries have laws to prevent the hunting of species that are facing extinction, known as endangered species. However, some hunting of these endangered animals continues. Only by refusing to buy the products that are made from endangered species can we prevent this terrible crime.
Australia, nature. Australia is the only country in the world that is also a continent. Located in the southern hemisphere between the Pacific and Indian Oceans, Australia is one of the largest countries in the world. Despite its vast size, Australia does not have a large population. In the year 2000, there were about 19 million people in Australia. Most Australians live within a short distance of the ocean because much of the interior of Australia is extremely dry. The remote areas of Australia, known as the outback, contain several sandy, rocky deserts. Some parts of the outback receive somewhat more rainfall and can support some grassy vegetation. In these areas, there are many ranches or farms where sheep and cattle are raised. Although the outback of Australia is a harsh place, some parts of it are quite beautiful. In the middle of the Australian continent, a large red rock known as Uluru stands in the desert. It is nearly 350 meters tall and is nearly 10 kilometers around. Tourists come from all over the world to see this huge and beautiful rock in the middle of a flat desert. In contrast to the dry interior areas, the northern coast of Australia receives a great deal of rainfall. This area is covered in thick, lush vegetation, with tropical rainforests whose exotic trees and flowers are found nowhere else in the world. Off the northeast coast of the continent, a large coral reef known as the Great Barrier Reef is found. A coral reef is a structure that consists of the bodies of small underwater animals called coral, whose dead bodies create this unusual structure beneath the surface of the water. The reef and the underwater life surrounding it are especially beautiful. Australia was separated from the rest of the world for millions of years. As a result, many of the plant and animal species in Australia are very different from those in other parts of the world. For example, many of the animals in Australia belong to a special category called the marsupials. Marsupials are mammals, but they are a special kind of mammal because they give birth to offspring that are not yet well developed. In many marsupials, the offspring continue to develop after being born inside a pocket or pouch on the mother's body. The most famous marsupial is the kangaroo. Kangaroos can travel at great speeds by hopping on their hind legs and using their large tails for balance. The kangaroo is a rather large animal, with the larger individuals sometimes weighing 90 kilograms. Another famous marsupial is the koala. This animal is sometimes called a koala bear because it looks somewhat like a small bear. The koala lives in the branches of trees called eucalyptus trees. Koalas eat the leaves of eucalyptus trees. Of course, Australia also has people. We will discuss the people of Australia in the next passage. Australia, people. The first people who lived in Australia were known as the Aborigines. The Aborigines came to Australia by boat more than 40,000 years ago. They are the first people in the world who are known to have used boats for transportation. Even though many parts of Australia were very inhospitable places, the Aborigines survived. They lived by hunting and gathering throughout the continent, even in the desert areas where survival is almost impossible. The Aborigines felt a deep spiritual attachment to the land, and they made many beautiful paintings upon the rocks of many parts of the country. Their most famous invention is a curved hunting stick known as the boomerang. The design of the boomerang is remarkable because it can be thrown in such a way that it will turn around and return to the person who threw it. Until about 200 years ago, the Aborigines had only a very limited amount of contact with people in the outside world. The next people to migrate to Australia were from the British Isles. Beginning in the late 18th century, Australia was used as a prison colony, where common criminals and political prisoners were sent from Britain. By the middle of the 19th century, many British people moved to Australia voluntarily to begin farms or to search for gold. By the late 19th century, Britain stopped sending its prisoners to Australia, but migration continued. After the arrival of the British colonists, the Aboriginal population declined sharply. This was partly due to disease, partly due to cruel treatment by settlers, and partly due to the loss of their traditional way of life. Today, the Aboriginal population is growing again, and the Australian government has taken some steps to correct the injustices of the past. The various parts of Australia were governed at first as separate colonies, but in 1901 they joined to form a single country. Australia continued to grow during the 20th century, and after World War II, it attracted many immigrants from countries in Europe. During the past few decades, many people have moved to Australia from various parts of Asia and from other parts of the world. Today, Australia consists of one territory, the Northern Territory, and 6 states: Western Australia, South Australia, Tasmania, Victoria, New South Wales, and Queensland. Tasmania is a small island off the southern coast, and Victoria, New South Wales, and Queensland are found in the eastern part of the country. The two largest cities in Australia are Sydney and Melbourne, both of which are in the southeastern part of the country. Sydney has a beautiful harbour that is one of the largest in the world, and Melbourne has many beautiful parks and gardens. The capital city of the country is Canberra, which is located between Sydney and Melbourne. Other large cities in Australia are Brisbane in the northeast, Perth in the southwest, and Adelaide in the south. The Earth revolves around the sun. 1 year is the time required for the Earth to travel around the sun. For most of history, however, people did not know that the Earth moved around the sun. Instead, people believed that the sun moved around the Earth. The old idea that the sun moved around the Earth is known as the geocentric theory. This idea was first made famous by an ancient Greek scientist, Ptolemy, who lived in Egypt nearly 2,000 years ago. Some other Greek philosophers had suggested instead that the Earth might travel around the sun. However, this idea, which is known as the heliocentric theory, was not widely accepted. For centuries, people in Europe did not seriously question Ptolemy's geocentric theory. During the early 15th century, however, a Polish astronomer named Nicholas Copernicus began to think that the heliocentric idea was right and that the geocentric idea was wrong. Shortly before his death, Copernicus wrote a book that described the mathematical details of his theory that the Earth revolved or traveled around the sun. Later, astronomers came to agree with Copernicus's view. One of the most famous of these was Galileo, an Italian scientist. Galileo is famous for demonstrating that light and heavy objects fall at exactly the same speed unless an object is so light that it is slowed by the air. Galileo was also the first astronomer to use a powerful telescope to observe the sky. He discovered many unknown features of the moon, the sun, and the planets. When Galileo announced that he believed in Copernicus's theory that the Earth revolved around the sun, some officials of the Roman Catholic Church were angry. They argued that this theory was against the beliefs of the Church. Some church officials disagreed with his view, but the authorities decided that Galileo should be punished by house arrest. In other words, Galileo was not allowed to leave his house. Also, Galileo was forced to make a public statement that renounced his belief in the heliocentric theory. At about the same time that Galileo supported the heliocentric idea, another astronomer did some important work that supported Copernicus's view. This astronomer was Johannes Kepler, who lived in Germany. Kepler used the observations of previous scientists to figure out the motion of the planets around the sun. He realized that the planets did not travel in circular paths, but instead in paths that were elliptical or oval in shape. Kepler's discoveries showed mathematically how the planets would revolve around the sun. Today, everyone knows that the Earth moves around the sun, but for a long time it seemed more reasonable to believe that the sun moved around the Earth. We can thank the great scientists of the past who discovered the surprising truth. George Washington Carver. George Washington Carver is possibly the most famous agricultural scientist of all time. He invented hundreds of products that could be made from crops such as peanuts and sweet potatoes, and he changed the methods of farming in the southern United States. The story of George Washington Carver's life is interesting and inspiring, as it shows how some people can achieve success despite adversity. George Washington Carver was born in a small town in the American state of Missouri in 1864 or 1865. He was named after the first president of the United States. George's parents were slaves. His father was killed in an accident, and his mother was kidnapped and later died. George and his brother were raised by a married couple, the Carvers, who had owned George's mother. George was often sick during his childhood, but he showed an intense interest in nature. The Carvers taught George to read and write, and he became known locally as an expert on plants. Later, the Carvers sent George to a school for African American children in a nearby town. After his graduation, George Washington Carver continued his education in the state of Iowa. While a student in Iowa, Carver had very little money and had to work at many jobs to afford the costs of his education. However, his knowledge of plants was very impressive, and after receiving his master's degree, he became a teacher at the college he had attended as a student. Soon, however, Carver moved south to the state of Alabama, where he worked as a teacher and researcher at a college for African American students. It was here that Carver stayed for the rest of his life, and it was here that he performed his important agricultural research. One problem for farmers in the southern United States was that the most widespread crops, cotton and tobacco, tended to remove nutrients from the soil. Carver realized that this problem could be solved to some extent by rotating the cotton and tobacco crops with other kinds of crops, such as peanuts and sweet potatoes, which could help to preserve the nutrients in the soil. Carver's discoveries made the peanut, the sweet potato, and the soybean very useful to southern farmers. He invented the food product known as peanut butter, plus hundreds of other products. For example, Carver found ways to produce plastics, ink, cooking oil, paints, and cosmetics from peanuts and other crops. Carver also developed a new variety of cotton. Carver received many awards for his scientific research, but he was never interested in fame or fortune. When Carver died in 1943, the American government made his birthplace a national monument. Today, Carver is still known as a great agricultural scientist.
The origins of Canada and the United States. Most people are aware that Canada and the United States are two very large countries in North America. However, most people do not know how these countries came to exist. The story of the creation of these countries is a very interesting one. During the 17th and 18th centuries, some people from England and from France moved across the Atlantic Ocean. English people lived on what is now the east coast of the United States, and French people lived in what is now Quebec, in the eastern part of Canada. The kings of England and France were often at war with each other. This meant that there was often fighting in North America between the soldiers of England and France. By about the year 1750, there were many more people in the English colonies than in the French colonies. When the next war began, the English king was determined to defeat the French and gain complete control of North America. The English assembled a large force of ships and soldiers and attacked the French at Quebec. The French fought bravely, but they were too few in numbers, and the English won the war. England then gained control of all of North America. After this war, the people of the English colonies in North America began to feel dissatisfied with their government. They were not represented in the English government, but they had to pay taxes to the English king. The taxes were used to pay for English soldiers who defended the American colonies, but the Americans did not want these soldiers. In 1775, the American settlers began to rebel, and in 1776, the Americans declared their independence. For several years, there was much fighting between the Americans and the English soldiers. For a while, it appeared that the Americans would lose, even though they fought bravely. Then, the King of France decided to help the Americans. He sent his ships and soldiers to America, and they helped the Americans to defeat the English forces. England recognized the United States of America as an independent country in 1783. However, England kept control of Canada. When the American colonies rebelled against England, some of the people who lived in those colonies did not rebel. Those people were called Loyalists because they were loyal to the king. When the war ended, the Loyalists had to leave the country. They moved northward to Canada, where they started new English-speaking colonies. During the year 1812, the Americans invaded Canada, but they were not able to conquer the country. During the 19th century, the people of Quebec continued to speak French and to maintain their French culture. Meanwhile, many more people moved to the English-speaking areas of Canada. In the year 1867, Quebec and the English-speaking colonies agreed to form a single country, Canada. By this time, there were two very large countries in the northern part of North America. Hawaii. Of the 50 states in the United States, 49 are located on the mainland of North America. The other state is Hawaii, which consists of several islands in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Hawaii is known as an especially beautiful and interesting place. The Hawaiian Islands were formed by volcanic eruptions that pushed molten rock called lava above the surface of the ocean. Some of the islands no longer have any volcanic activity, but there are still active volcanoes on two Hawaiian islands, Oahu and the Big Island, which is known simply as Hawaii. One of these volcanoes, Mauna Loa, still erupts sometimes with spectacular explosions of lava. Another volcano, called Mauna Kea, is now dormant. These volcanoes are both very tall and reach over 4,000 meters above sea level. The air above Mauna Kea is so clear and thin that scientists use the mountain as a base for observing the stars. The islands of Hawaii are located in the tropics, and they are known for their beautiful weather. The temperatures are usually in the range of 20 to 30 degrees Celsius, and the days are usually sunny. This weather allows people to enjoy swimming and surfing on the beautiful beaches of Hawaii. Despite the sunshine, most of the islands also receive enough rainfall to support many beautiful flowers and trees. The first people to live in Hawaii were Polynesian groups who arrived from other islands in the Pacific well over 1,000 years ago. The islands were visited by European explorers during the late 18th century. During the early 19th century, the islands became unified under a single king. However, during this time, many Hawaiians died from diseases that were brought by European and American visitors. The Hawaiian Islands are excellent places for growing sugarcane and pineapples. In the late 18th century, some Americans began large farms called plantations in Hawaii. The Americans eventually gained control of the government, and Hawaii became a territory of the United States. The United States built a naval base on the island of Oahu at Pearl Harbor. This base was attacked by Japan in 1941, but it was soon repaired. The naval base is still in use today. During the 19th and 20th centuries, there were great demand for labor on the sugar and pineapple plantations. People came to Hawaii from many lands, and Hawaii became a place of many cultures. The native Hawaiians mixed with people from places such as Japan, China, Korea, the Philippines, Portugal, and Puerto Rico, as well as the mainland United States. Today, many Hawaiians can claim a diverse heritage. In 1959, Hawaii became the 50th state of the United States, with the city of Honolulu as its capital. Today, there are more than 1 million people in Hawaii, more than half of whom live in Honolulu. Each year, many more people visit Hawaii as tourists to experience the beauty of these islands.
Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin made what might be the most important scientific discovery of all time, the theory of evolution by natural selection. It was Darwin who first understood how it was that plants and animals evolved over time to produce new and different species. At first, this theory faced much opposition, but since that time, it has been supported by evidence from many areas of science. Darwin was born in a small town in England in 1809. When he was a young man, he went to university, first to study medicine, and later to study religion. However, Darwin found his schoolwork to be very boring. Instead, he preferred outdoor activities and was very interested in nature. While Darwin was at university, the British Navy was planning to send one of its ships, called the Beagle, on a voyage of exploration. As part of this voyage, the ship would need a naturalist who could study the various plants and animals that might be found. Darwin was recommended for this job by one of his professors who had been impressed by Darwin. Darwin was chosen as the naturalist of the Beagle, and the ship left England in 1831. The ship's voyage took Darwin around the world, and he observed many species of plants and animals on his trip. In one place near South America, known as the Galapagos Islands, Darwin observed many unusual species of birds. Several of these birds seemed closely related to each other, but they differed in interesting ways. For example, some birds had long beaks that could reach insects hidden in the bark of trees, but other birds had thick beaks that could break open the shells of nuts. What Darwin realized was that certain characteristics could help an animal or a plant to survive and reproduce. Individuals that lacked those characteristics would become more likely to die without reproducing. Over many generations, the useful characteristics would then become more and more common as the surviving individuals passed the characteristics on to their offspring. Eventually, after many generations, the changes would be so great that a new species would exist. In this way, a single species could divide into two or more new ones. This was called the process of evolution by natural selection. When Darwin returned to England, he studied plants and animals in more detail. After much research, he began writing a book about his theory of evolution by natural selection. When the book The Origin of Species was published in 1859, it was very popular and very controversial. During the next 20 years, Darwin continued his scientific research, and he wrote several more books. By the time of his death in 1882, many biologists had realized that Darwin had made one of the most important scientific discoveries of all time. For the first time, scientists could understand the origin of the many different species of plants and animals. Jazz. One of the most popular forms of music is known as jazz. Each year, hundreds of thousands of people attend jazz concerts and festivals in cities around the world. Jazz music, both old and new, is played on the radio and on home stereos. Two of the most important features of jazz music are improvisation and syncopation. Improvisation means that music is created spontaneously by the musician during a performance. In other words, the musician modifies some existing music in a new and interesting way. Syncopation means that the regular patterns found in music may be broken up, with new accents and uneven patterns being created. The features of improvisation and syncopation are difficult to use with skill and require great creativity on the part of the musician. Jazz music originated in the southern United States during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It was based on African American music that was derived in part from rhythms in Western Africa. The earliest jazz musicians were influenced by a music style known as ragtime, which was popular during the late 19th century. Jazz music also incorporated some aspects of a related kind of music called the blues. By the beginning of the 20th century, a fully developed form of jazz was being played in New Orleans, a city in the southern United States. Jazz musicians played instruments such as the trumpet, saxophone, cornet, and piano. Jazz soon became popular and was played on the riverboats that traveled along the Mississippi River. Some jazz musicians moved north to the city of Chicago, and young musicians in that city developed some new forms of jazz music. By the 1920s and 1930s, jazz was popular in many parts of the United States, and some musicians began forming large bands, comprising many musicians and many different instruments. This began the period known as the Big Band era, when a popular form of jazz known as swing music was played. During the 1940s and 1950s, other forms of jazz known as bop and cool jazz were developed. Some people preferred these newer kinds of jazz, but others preferred the older varieties. By the 1960s, some jazz musicians began to experiment with different kinds of musical instruments and with other kinds of music. Some musicians incorporated musical styles from other parts of the world, or combined jazz with rock music. And today, some musicians have blended jazz with rap music. However, some people prefer the more traditional forms of jazz music. Of course, most of the great jazz musicians of the early 20th century, people such as Louis Armstrong, Duke Ellington, Count Basie, Dizzy Gillespie, and Billie Holiday, are no longer alive. However, many great jazz musicians are still active, and many younger musicians have continued this form of music. People will continue to enjoy jazz music for a long time to come.
The Mississippi River. The Mississippi River is the longest river within the United States and the fourth longest river in the world. This river holds a special place in American history and literature and in the imagination of ordinary Americans. The Mississippi River begins in the hills of northern Minnesota near the Canadian border and flows southward about 3,700 kilometers through 10 states before draining its water and silt into the Gulf of Mexico. Traditionally, the river is viewed as a natural boundary between the eastern and western halves of the United States. Until the year 1803, the areas to the west of the Mississippi River and the areas around the mouth of the river were claimed by Spain and by France. In that year, the French Emperor Napoleon decided to sell this land to the United States of America. This sale, which is called the Louisiana Purchase, was very important for the United States. By controlling the Mississippi River, the Americans would be able to use it for transporting goods and people in this rapidly developing area. For many years, riverboats were the main method of long-distance transportation for people living near the Mississippi. Steam-powered boats with large paddle wheels that pushed the boat forward were very popular in the time before cars and airplanes. One of the famous cities along the Mississippi River is St. Louis. This city is known as the Gateway to the West. During the 19th century, St. Louis was the last large town that people would pass through on their way to a new farmland farther west. Today, St. Louis is famous for the Gateway Arch, a tall monument that welcomes people to the West. St. Louis is also known as the city where the music known as the blues began. Near the mouth of the Mississippi River is another famous city, New Orleans. In terms of the styles of buildings, New Orleans is said to be the most unusual American city because it is influenced so strongly by Spanish and French traditions. Even today, the traditional festival of Mardi Gras is celebrated in New Orleans each year. New Orleans and the surrounding areas of the state of Louisiana are famous for spicy Cajun food. This style of cooking was developed by the French-speaking settlers of Louisiana. The Mississippi River is famous in many stories of American literature. For example, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn, which were written by the author Mark Twain, are both set along the Mississippi River. Today, the federal and state governments of the United States are working to preserve the natural environment along the Mississippi River. People recognize the importance of keeping this river healthy and clean. Doctors Without Borders. In 1999, the Nobel Prize for Peace was won by the organization known as Doctors Without Borders. This is the English name for the organization, based in Belgium, which won the prize for its humanitarian assistance to people around the world in areas that have been struck by disaster. The fundamental ideas of Doctors Without Borders is that people who suffer from a disaster have the right to receive professional help as soon as possible. The organization helps people regardless of their nationality, race, religion, ethnicity, sex, or political opinions. Also, the assistance provided by Doctors Without Borders is given in response to all kinds of disasters, such as famines, earthquakes, and wars. The people who belong to Doctors Without Borders are experienced medical workers who volunteer their time, effort, and skills in an attempt to help people who are in need. These volunteers include doctors, nurses, surgeons, anesthetists, laboratory technicians, and other medical workers. There are also some non-medical volunteers who work for Doctors Without Borders in positions of administration or logistics. Volunteers must first take a course before participating in a humanitarian mission. They promise to abide by a code of professional ethics, and they promise to remain neutral in any conflicts within a disaster area. A mission typically lasts about 6 months, but the duration varies. The volunteers are insured by the organization, but they are not paid in any way for their work. When Doctors Without Borders began in 1971, it consisted of only a few French doctors who wanted to provide humanitarian aid to people in disaster areas. Over the years, it grew rapidly, and by 2001, Doctors Without Borders had 2,500 volunteers working in 80 countries around the world. They have helped people by providing emergency health care, vaccinations, medicine, water, and basic food, and also by developing improved water and sanitation systems. In many areas, Doctors Without Borders has also helped to provide basic medical training to local people. Although Doctors Without Borders remains neutral in any conflicts within a disaster area, the organization does speak out against abuses of human rights. By remaining independent of the influence of governments and corporations, Doctors Without Borders is able to criticize the people and organizations who cause suffering. The volunteers are witnesses who tell the world about the cruelty that is inflicted upon innocent people. Obviously, the work of Doctors Without Borders is extremely important. The volunteers of this organization are brave and selfless people whose efforts have relieved the suffering of millions of people. Chicago. Chicago is one of the most famous American cities. Some cities in the United States, such as New York, Los Angeles, and San Francisco, may be more glamorous, but many people agree that Chicago is the city that best represents the United States. Located in the middle of North America, Chicago has derived much benefit from its geography. The city's central location has made its O'Hare International Airport the hub for most airlines in the United States. Its location on the shores of Lake Michigan has made it a major port and business center, where the agricultural and industrial products of the American Midwest are shipped overseas. Until about the 1830s, Chicago was a minor trading post, but then it grew rapidly as the most important town in the rapidly developing areas of the Midwestern United States. In 1871, the city was destroyed by a fire. It is often said that the fire started when a cow knocked over an oil lamp. It took about 20 years for the city to be completely rebuilt, but it continued to expand. In 1882, the first skyscraper was built in Chicago. Around the turn of the century, the population of Chicago was growing quickly. Many African American people moved to Chicago from the southern United States, and many immigrants from Eastern Europe also arrived in Chicago during this time. Because of the busy and active atmosphere of the city, an American poet described Chicago as the city of broad shoulders. Chicago became notorious for organized crime during the Prohibition era of the 1920s, when the sale of alcohol was illegal. Mobsters such as Al Capone became rich by smuggling liquor, and many people were killed in conflicts between rival gangs of criminals. But the influence of organized crime later became weaker. In the decades following World War II, Chicago experienced some problems with crime, poverty, and racial conflict. However, the city has recently prospered, and social conditions have improved for many people in Chicago. Compared with other large cities, Chicago is viewed as an affordable place to live, with a high quality of life. The city has efficient transportation and many beautiful parks along the Lake Michigan shoreline. Chicago is famous for its many attractions, including the Art Institute of Chicago, the Field Museum of Natural History, the Shedd Aquarium, the Sears Tower, and the Miracle Mile Shopping District. Indeed, Chicago is one of the most interesting cities in the United States. Women and the right to vote. In most countries today, people think it is obvious that all adults should have the right to vote in democratic elections. But it was not so long ago that women did not have this right. Only after a long struggle did women gain the right to vote. By the early 19th century, modern democratic forms of government were appearing in the United States, Great Britain, and some European countries. In these countries, most adult men had the right to vote in democratic elections. Some men were denied this right if they were poor, or if they belonged to a racial minority group, but gradually this right was extended to all men. It took much longer for women to gain the right to vote. Only in special cases, such as that of a widow who owned land, could a woman be allowed to vote. Many men believed that it was not necessary for women to vote, because they assumed that the husband should decide on behalf of his wife. Some men believed that women did not possess the intelligence or the discipline to vote carefully. Some women also believed that women should not be involved in politics, but many others wanted the right to vote. By about the year 1850, some women began to organize in an effort to change the laws regarding women and the vote. This movement was known as the woman suffrage movement, because the word suffrage means voting. Leaders such as Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton brought attention to this issue and persuaded many people that women should vote. The first part of the United States to recognize women's right to vote was Wyoming in the year 1869. During the following decades, many other states recognized women's right to vote, particularly in the western part of the country where women had a high social status. However, the United States was not the first country to recognize women's right to vote at the national level. The first country to recognize women's right to vote was New Zealand in 1893. Soon after, Australia also allowed women to vote, and so did the Scandinavian countries of Northern Europe. But in countries such as the United States, Canada, and Great Britain, women could not yet vote. Women in those countries struggled to gain the vote. For example, in Great Britain, Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters participated in hunger strikes. During World War I, 1914 to 1918, women's work efforts were very important to winning the war, and people's attitudes were increasingly in favor of women having the right to vote. Women then gained the right to vote in Canada, the United States, and Great Britain. Gradually, other democracies around the world also recognize women's right to vote. Today, it seems difficult to believe that women were not allowed to vote only a few generations ago. But there is still progress to be made. In most countries, women are underrepresented among political leaders. Perhaps the day will soon come when women are elected as often as men.